Welcome back to part 2 of my video on how Debbie Reynolds, aka Grandma Aggie from Halloween Town, was involved in one of the biggest Hollywood scandals of all time. Like I said in part 1, Debbie Reynolds and her husband Eddie Fisher rushed to Elizabeth Taylor's house when they found out about her husband's passing. When they arrived, Elizabeth had just been informed that her husband Mike Todd passed away in a plane crash by the doctor, and she was hysterical, so Debbie Reynolds took her children back to her house with her kids and had Eddie stay with Elizabeth. Now, Debbie started to realize something fishy was going down because Elizabeth had to go to New York, and then all of a sudden Eddie had to go to New York for work. And rumors started to swirl that Elizabeth and Eddie were having an affair, so Debbie decided to call his hotel room and he didn't answer. But then she called Elizabeth's room and Eddie answered the phone and she could hear Elizabeth talking in the background. About a month later, he ended up calling Debbie saying that he was in love with Elizabeth and was leaving her for good. And Debbie admitted at first that she thought this was a fling and he would eventually come back. And because of her religious background, she did not want to sin by getting a divorce. But eventually she realized who he was, so they did divorce. And Eddie and Elizabeth ended up getting married. This became a tabloid and media frenzy unlike anything the entertainment industry had seen before. And MGM, the studio that Debbie Reynolds was signed to, was making her work overtime so that they could financially profit from this scandal. But don't you worry, because karma would come back and get Eddie when Elizabeth Taylor booked the movie Cleopatra and met the second greatest love of her life, Richard Burton. And this affair was so steamy because Richard and her were married at the time that they started their affair that it was condemned by the Vatican. I'll explain all of this in part 3 and also tell you about the time that Elizabeth and Debbie came face to face on a cruise ship.